So it's a real pleasure to introduce Anna Wild Mathews. She's a Wall Street Journal reporter on healthcare since 1996 and has won a part of a team Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting in 2015 and a finalist in 2011 for the Pulitzer Prize. As a side note, I've known Anna for probably a decade or more, and when I was at Healthcare Partners, I spent a lot of time trying to plant some really nice puff pieces that she rejected. And so I'm glad to see that she believes in real news and not fake news. And so please welcome Anna to
Hi. So forgive me because I think we had a lot yesterday looking at Washington, and trying to write this speech, I found myself unable to do anything talking about forecasting without talking about Washington. So I apologize for that. I just couldn't get around it. There's nothing else in my life right now professionally. So, start out by confessing I don't have any slides. I'm sorry for that. Very non-technical, but you can feel free to text your friends or check out the president's tweets or whatever. I figured that was a bonus in some ways. Unlike a lot of people in this audience, I would imagine, I never went past my bachelor's degree. But there is one aspect of the university experience that I experienced many, many, many times, which is commencement addresses. My dad was a college administrator, so I went to a commencement every single year when I was growing up. It was very, very fantastic, a sort of Groundhog Day thing annually for us as kids. So in all those platitudes and pomp and circumstance renditions, there was one speech that stood out, and it's the only one I still remember, including my own commencement address when I graduated. It was by the writer and humorist Calvin Trillin, and the title, which he also used as the title of a book later on, was Too Soon to Tell. So I'm here to rip that off and make that the theme of what I'm saying today, which is too soon to tell. So what will happen to value-based care under the Trump administration? Too soon to tell. Will Congress move Medicaid to a block grant or a per capita funding mechanism? Will it preserve the current matches? Too soon to tell. How many people will be covered under the repealed, replaced, revamped, repaired, regurgitated ACA? Too soon to tell. I'm not trying to be cute here. I actually just think genuinely no one really knows what's going to come out the other end here. But I do want to talk about what I think are some of the more interesting and important questions sort of underlying what the discussions will be over the next months or even years. I see them through the prism of the beat I cover, which is the managed care industry. So there are other sort of ways of looking at what's coming, but that's where I spend my time. They aren't new questions. They're maybe to some degree eternal questions, and I have to admit I've spent the last several months dusting off old notes from 2009, 2010. I bet I'm not the only one to go back to high-risk pools. Yeah, oh yeah, now I remember. So I'm going to focus on 4 questions. One is more immediate, and the others we'll just have to see. The first and most immediate one is what is the individual health insurance market going to look like next year? I mean, I don't think we know what it's going to look like after that, but next year I think is the most immediate question. As you all know, it's a limited slice of the population. There are about 18 million people with individual coverage currently, but it's a very important one. And over the next several months, the managed care companies will have to decide if they're going to remain in the exchanges, under what circumstances will they remain in the exchanges, and what are they going to do about their rates. There are already signs of strain. In 2017, 32% of U.S. counties have just one exchange insurer. That figure was 7% in 2016. When I talked to one insurance CEO recently about how his company was trying to work up rates for exchange plans in 2018, he said, quote, "It's almost embarrassing to call it a model. It's more like a Ouija board." Just a couple of sort of data points that have already emerged. Humana, which was in 11 exchanges in 2017, said that it will pull out completely in 2018. And they said that even before they really had any clue what Congress was going to do. Anthem, Cigna, Aetna have all said their exchange footprints are under review. Molina, and I know Melina was here yesterday, but they've until recently been successful and sort of made a go of that business, but they're also showing signs of trouble, and they're now saying they are going to reconsider their presence for next year. The CEO of Molina said to me that he was, quote, very concerned we won't be able to participate in the marketplace next year. It would be irresponsible for us to go forward based on a PowerPoint presentation. Another CEO of a smaller health plan told me he was looking at a 40% rate increase at least for his health exchange products next year, and it was probably going to be higher. I mean, the 40% was assuming that CSRs and APTCs remain in effect, which is, perhaps in question. As you probably know, the Trump administration has proposed a rule that aimed at stabilizing the markets, and I think that a lot of companies that I talk to are hopeful that all of the warnings and shots across the bow that they're firing publicly and less so are going to have an effect. But I do think it's hard to tell where it'll end up. Aetna's CEO recently told the Journal in an interview that we streamed online that he thought the marketplaces were already in a death spiral. So I'm not sure everyone in this audience or that everyone in the industry would agree with that assessment. It was pretty dramatic, but certainly I think everyone would agree there are issues. And I spent the morning running around on this, but President Trump, it looks like, is going to meet with a bunch of the managed care CEOs on Monday. So it'll be interesting to see what leaks out of that conversation and what he says to them. I think the second of the big questions I wanted to throw out there is whether we will see a shift, at least to a certain degree, in health coverage towards something closer to a defined contribution approach instead of a defined benefit approach. That's a theme that I've sort of seen emerging across a number of different fronts recently. Not a new idea again, but I'm sure you all know that at the most simplistic, what that would mean is an employee or a consumer or a beneficiary gets a chunk of money, that's the technical term, a chunk of money that can be used to obtain coverage, and if the coverage costs more than that, the individual is sort of on the hook for the difference. The people who favor those ideas say that they can save money for payers and that they can create incentives for competition and efficiency, and they offer more ability for consumers to select plans that fit their individual needs, not less one size fits all. The argument against it, which I'm sure you all could come up with on your own without me telling you, but I will give it anyway, is that people may not be able to afford the coverage that they want or need, and that over time, as healthcare costs mount, those defined contributions may not mount at the same rate. So where have we seen this idea sort of starting to emerge? If you look at the recent House Republican proposal that emerged last week, and I'm not talking about the one that Politico reported this morning, although that seemed to be, as far as I could tell from a quick skim, a more detailed version of the one that the speaker released last week. But they were looking at getting rid of the APTCs, the income-linked subsidies that the ACA created, and replacing those with tax credits that would be linked to age. It appeared, again, there's not a ton of detail here, but it appeared that those would be a set amount offered regardless of income, and it wasn't clear at all that those amounts would be adjusted based on what would happen with premiums. So again, as you I'm sure all know, the ACA sort of caps out the percentage of income that a person of low income can be required to pay. These seem to be like lump sums based on your age, and it is what it is, right? So that's clearly sort of maybe one signal. If you look at what the House proposals on Medicaid said, again, it's a very different setup, again, as you all know, but there's some common DNA there, I think. A block grant or a per capita allotment could ensure that the federal commitment amounts to essentially a chunk of funding, either for the state or a chunk per person that the state enrolls. It appeared to control the pace at which that funding would rise over time, not tying the contribution to the cost of the actual benefit the state was offering. So again, something a little more akin to perhaps a defined contribution going from the federal treasury to the states. In the employer sector, there was a lot of talk a few years ago about private exchanges. As again, you all know probably, a private exchange doesn't have to be a defined contribution, but often that's part of the appeal for the employer, that there's a defined contribution. Those haven't grown, I think, at the rate that a few years ago some of the boosters were saying they would, but current estimate from Accenture is that the growth in terms of enrollment in private exchanges last year was 35% to about 8 million people. So it is growing. And then on the employer front, there was a sort of provision that passed last year in a broader bill that reauthorized HRAs that could be funded by an employer, and it said that that money could be used for employers with a number of employees under 50. That money could be applied by the employee toward purchasing a plan on the individual market. So, and it would sort of receive the same tax advantages as a traditional employer group plan. So again, I think that was an interesting move, and also, one wonders if that could be expanded to larger employers, and if so, that would certainly incentivize a more defined contribution kind of approach. And finally, on the Medicare front, I don't think anyone's predicting sort of immediate or large change on the Medicare front, but if you look back at the Better Way proposal from last June, it does include premium support, what some people might call vouchers, that would enable beneficiaries to purchase coverage on a Medicare exchange. So again, I think it's a theme that you see emerging across a number of fronts and worth watching and considering sort of what does that mean, or how would it affect everybody. So my third question, that was number 2. My third question to watch is sort of a broad and kind of philosophical eternal question, which is what does insurance need to cover? The ACA gave us an answer, sort of the first federal answer, I would think. The 10 essential health benefits: prescription drugs, mental health, substance abuse disorder, habilitative services, maternity, all of these things. An actuarial value of 60% for most people. No annual or lifetime limits on payouts. I think now it's possible, we don't know what's going to pass, but it's possible you could see a new answer emerge, or 50 new answers. We don't know, again, I don't know if this is something that could be done through reconciliation, so that obviously is a practical question, but I do think it's a debate you're going to see waged. Seema Verma, in her testimony, her confirmation testimony before the Senate, she said she supported, quote, Americans being able to decide what benefits package works best for them. And she specifically seemed to say that plans really should be available without maternity benefits. That was one specific thing she was asked about. Republicans have generally supported pairing federal insurance mandates or getting rid of them altogether, and talk about giving states more ability to define requirements. Another sort of thing in the House Republican ACA repeal outline that came out last week was that consumers should be able to apply those federal tax credits they want to have to, quote, currently prohibited catastrophic plans. They didn't obviously give a specific actuarial value to what a currently prohibited catastrophic plan would be, or a further definition beyond that, but one can assume that it would involve an actuarial value lower than 60%. At least that's what I assumed. You guys in this audience, again, probably have a pretty good sense of what happens when you loosen the requirements on plans, but the short version is there are definitely going to be cheaper options for those who don't want all the benefits. People can buy what they need, as Ms. Verma said. The downside of that is that people who do want the richer benefits find themselves often paying more for them because it's a smaller pool of people. And possibly they might not be available at all if plans decide that the risk equation in terms of who would sign up for those benefits does not make them really a sustainable thing to offer. And certainly all the actuaries I've talked about this with felt that was a realistic possibility for a number of areas if there aren't requirements and if guaranteed issue remains in effect. I think it's worth looking at what individual plans looked like before the ACA's rules, just a little, trip in the Wayback Machine. In 2013, only about 2% of individual policies then being sold included all of the ACA's essential benefits. Around a third covered maternity and newborn care, 54% had substance abuse services, 61% included mental health treatments. A 2012 study in Health Affairs, which focused on 5 states, found that more than half of people with individual plans had coverage that wouldn't qualify for what is now the health law's Brown's tier. Obviously, one thing to keep in mind, and again, I know you all know this, but that market was very different in terms of who was in it. It was an underwritten market. So, it's not clear that you would see any resemblance to that if you, took away the essential health benefits requirements, but left guaranteed issue in effect nationwide. My fourth question is, what are they going to do with the sick people? That's a pretty key question. Again, I'm focused on the individual market, although obviously the fundamental economics are true across all types of coverage. The 10% of people with the highest costs account for about 2/3 of health spending. Someone has to pay for that, and they can't. That's why they need insurance. The ACA, as you guys know, mandated guaranteed issue and community rating. We know, again, I probably don't need to define those things for you guys, but before the law, roughly 18% of individual insurance applicants were rejected, and that figure doesn't include the people who, didn't bother to apply, and the people who were sold plans but were rated up or had sort of pre-X conditions that would not be covered under the plans that they were sold. Republicans have repeatedly said they want to ensure that people with pre-existing conditions are able to obtain coverage. They've also said they want to get rid of the individual mandate. So where are we going there? I don't know. We all know what does happen when you have guaranteed issue and community rating and there's no mandate or other mechanism for getting healthy people into the pool. You do have that death spiral that Mark Bertolini thinks we're in now. If anyone here is from Washington State or New York, you know what it looks like. If we look back at the Better Way blueprint, now this I should say in the more recent House outline, they didn't really address this, perhaps because it's not a fun question to talk about. But in the earlier blueprint, they talked about a continuous coverage standard. It would suggest that people who did not maintain continuous coverage, had a gap in their coverage, could potentially be underwritten when they tried to get back into the market. I think, according to Politico, it looked like they're now talking about maybe a 30% premium increase rather than just pure underwriting, risk-based premiums. So I don't know where they'll end up, but that seems to be perhaps their substitute for the individual market. The Republicans also talked about high-risk pools. The House blueprint talked about state innovation grants, which would be the, quote, next generation of high-risk pools. Not really clear what that would look like, but they were very clear. These are not your daddy's high-risk pools. It's very different, but it wasn't exactly clear how so. So those are my four big questions, I think, that are worth watching, at least in the beat that I cover in the sort of managed care space. What will happen in the individual market next year? Are we moving toward defined contributions? What will insurance need to cover in the future? And then what about the sick people, particularly in the individual market? I do, again, as I said at the beginning, think the answer on all these things is probably too soon to tell, and maybe there'll be one answer in the next 2 years and then another answer 4 years from now, depending on what's going on in Washington. But I think those are questions sort of at the macro level worth watching. I had one more thought I wanted to share. As someone who reports in this area, I do talk to a lot of consumers about their health coverage and about the ACA. One thing that's very striking, people do have very strong emotional views about the ACA and often strong opinions about their own coverage, but most of them really have a very limited understanding of either the law, in fact, or much about their own coverage often. Now, I think it's easy to sort of say, well, what else is new, right? Like, of course they don't. And I myself have not read the entire ACA, nor would I claim to fully understand it. I'm not sure how many people could. But I do think that it's an important thing to not just sort of dismiss and sort of say, whatever, too bad, no one gets it, it's really complicated. I think there is as we once again debate this law and what to do about it, I think there's a risk, no matter what your views of the law or about what should replace it, if anything, or what your political party, that there's a danger in this lack of understanding. I think it's hard to be an informed voter or a consumer if you don't actually understand what's going on. Perhaps that's a question for educators to consider. I suppose we all know, I suppose we all could point a finger at who's to blame for that situation. It's probably the media, so mea culpa, but I did want to raise that because I think it's a very serious and perhaps under-discussed issue. I don't have an answer for it, but I think it's something to keep in mind. That's it. Thank you.